So Senator Mitch McConnell, what's on your reading list these days?
Well, not surprisingly, I tend to tilt toward American history, much of it political. But actually, one book I just finished was not about politics. It was about the history of the polio epidemic from beginning to end. It came out in 2006, actually won a Pulitzer Prize. And as a polio victim myself, I have always had a kind of special interest in it. And I thought with the pandemic going on, there were some lessons there, particularly with regard to vaccines. And one of the things we've been preaching lately is get vaccinated. And of course, one of the big differences between the situation we find ourselves in now and polio is it took 70 years to come up with 2 effective vaccines for polio. Our marvelous country and our marvelous pharmaceutical industry came up with 3 effective vaccines in less than 1 year to give us an opportunity to get past the pandemic. One of the most interesting things about the polio period was FDR came down with polio at age 39. Most people thought of it as kind of a children's disease, but it did hit adults from time to time. And in his own struggle to come back and ultimately go all the way to the White House, he set up Warm Springs, a place he would go after he was afflicted because the springs were warm. It was down in Georgia and made him feel better to get in the water. That led to the establishment of a foundation, which led to something that was commonly referred to as the March of Dimes. And ultimately, after a long struggle and after Roosevelt's death, they helped finance the research done by Sabin and Salk. And it's a fascinating story about taking a particular disease, turning it into a prominent sales campaign. They actually financed the March of Dimes largely, listen to this, by passing the hat in movie theaters. And people would drop their dimes in. And in that era, they actually raised enough money to fund most of the research and also the facilities that developed at Warm Springs, where the best physical therapists in the country at that time were. I was fortunate enough to be about an hour's drive from Warm Springs. My mother took me over there. They taught her physical therapy regimens. I was an outpatient, and she would go back home, and here's one of the things they told her. A 2-year-old boy, by the way, 2-year-old boy, don't let him walk. So she must have watched me like a hawk all day, every day to keep me off my feet. And she would do these exercises on my left leg in the hopes that I would get enough of a comeback, if you will, to not be wearing a brace the rest of my life. One other little tidbit related to FDR, we compared my outpatient visits to Warm Springs with when FDR was there. He was there 2 times when I went over for visits, including the week that he died. He died at Warm Springs in April of 1945.
Do you have residual effects from your polio?
I do, but I've had a normal life. It affected my left quadricep, and I've always had difficulty going downstairs. I was never particularly good at running, but I don't, I've had a normal life. I mean, many polio patients died. Some ended up in iron lungs for an interminable period of time, or had lifetime disabilities way more severe than mine. So I was fortunate. I had a mother who pursued her instructions relentlessly, like a drill sergeant in the Army. And so I've been very lucky. And I was lucky to be near Warm Springs because that was the one place in the country where people knew, at least at that time, what the best techniques were to try to bring you back to normal.
When you were reading, were there aha moments going to
Well,
you as a policymaker here today?
When I was reading the book?
Yes, and going, oh.
Well, it was
we're
a
going through
fascinating
that
public
now.
relations campaign led by the President of the United States, who would get entertainers and others interested in promoting the fundraising. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, that was a little bit like a campaign. And apparently it was the first public campaign devoted to going for a treatment to a disease. That was what was unique about it. They took these geniuses the president met who were good at selling things, and they turned it into a campaign that reached a broad audience and actually produced the funds to pay ultimately for the cure.
You mentioned that you usually read American history. In the last 6 months, what have you been reading?
Well, John Marshall Harlan, the great dissenter. The sole dissent in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Went to Center College in Kentucky. He went to what they called a law school in those days at Transylvania in Kentucky. Kentucky was a border state during the Civil War. He sided with the Union, had political aspirations, tried to get elected governor twice as a Republican after the war, but Kentucky, curiously enough, Kentucky, even though it never seceded, sort of went over to the South after the war and became totally Democratic. Harlan had a famous law partner named Benjamin Bristow, who served in the Grant administration. And Harlan thought Bristow would be the perfect candidate for President of the United States on the Republican ticket after 8 years of the Grant administration, which had had a lot of problems with scandals. Bristow was the guy Grant brought in to try to clean up the mess. And the mess in those days was the Customs House in New York, which produced most of the revenue for the government. He made Bristow Secretary of the Treasury after he had earlier been Solicitor General. In fact, he was the first Solicitor General of the United States. And so he was thought of as sort of Mr. Clean. And Harlan was his friend and for a short period of time his law partner, and I'm sure the two of them talked about it. Of course, in those days, if you wanted to be president, you didn't admit it. You know, you had to act like you were being drafted. So the Republican convention's in Cincinnati, not too far from Louisville, my hometown and Harlan's hometown at that point. So Harlan goes to the GOP convention in Cincinnati with the goal of getting the nomination for President of the United States in 1876 for Benjamin Bristow, his good friend, Mr. Clean. After a few ballots, it became clear to Harlan that he wasn't going to be able to pull it off. And so on a key roll call, 4 or 5 times into the convention, Harlan throws the Bristow delegates to the former governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. So you can imagine the rest of the story. It was not uncommon in those days for presidents to put their campaign managers on the Supreme Court. In fact, Abraham Lincoln did that. And so in 1877, in the first year of the Hayes administration, it was not Benjamin Bristow who was appointed to the Supreme Court, but John Marshall Harlan. And he served from 1877 to 1911. He was the reason every law student knows John Marshall Harlan, and I might just say parenthetically, Justice Gorsuch, when he was before the before the Senate Judiciary Committee, was asked, who was your favorite Supreme Court justice? John Marshall Harlan. Interestingly enough, Marshall's father named him John Marshall after the most significant Chief Justice in American history, in the hopes that his young son might end up on the Supreme Court, and by golly, he did. And so the sole dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson was this, that segregation on rail cars was constitutionally impermissible under the newly passed amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Sole dissent. It reads like the majority unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education 58 years later. That's why John Marshall Harlan's photograph is on my wall. And I was thrilled a few months ago to see that this new book had come out about his life and times, and it's a marvelous read, extremely well written. I highly recommend it to your viewers.
When do you find time to read? Do you have to actually schedule it?
It takes me a while to finish a book. I typically am reading them on planes or on weekends. I'm not one of those people who can read at night. I'm usually sleepy. So I'm not what I would call a fast reader, but I'm a consistent reader. I'm probably a 8 or 10 book a year person. And most of it is in the area of, not surprisingly, American history. Another book I read recently was a marvelous book about the Truman-Dewey 48 election. That sort of thing is what typically you find in my briefcase.
What about any books on another famous Kentuckian, Henry Clay?
I've read a lot of them. You know, if you live in Kentucky, everybody's heard of Henry Clay. And in fact, I did my senior thesis in college on the Compromise of 1850, which was Clay's last great compromise in his quest to hold the Union together with all the strains and stresses we had related to slavery. There's been a lot of books written about Henry Clay, and I've certainly not read anywhere near all of them, but I've read a number of them.
Do you ever recommend books to your colleagues?
I do occasionally. This Harlan book that we were just discussing, I'm recommending to all the members of my conference who are particularly interested in the law and the Supreme Court, which is a significant number of our members.
Any fiction in this game? In your reading, any fiction in your reading?
I confess, I rarely read fiction. The last book I read, interestingly enough, was also about polio. That was a novel. It was called Nemesis, and it was like a historical novel. The characters were made up, but the facts were similar, and it was about the polio epidemic of 1944, which interestingly enough happened to be the same year I came down with it.
Senator McConnell, a couple last questions. Your 2020 opponent, Amy McGrath, has a new book coming out. Is that one that will catch your attention at all?
Gosh, honestly, I don't usually read these current books. There are a lot of them. I might take a look at it. I figure it might have some mention of me.
Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican leader of the U.S. Senate, thank you for your time on Book TV.
Thank you.